This is part 2 of my review for Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Episode 3, because I broke it up into smaller videos based on storyline. In this part, I'm talking about Númenor. Well, Númenor, leaving out all of the Halbrand scenes, that's what part 1 was for. I said I realized what parts I didn't like. It wasn't that I didn't like Galadriel in Episode 2, I didn't like when Halbrand was in her storyline. That Episode 3, I realized the bad parts of this were all the invented Halbrand scenes, because he isn't a book character, and we think maybe he's supposed to be Sauron or the Witch King, and this is a condensing how Sauron seduced his way into everyone trusting him. We don't know, but that was what part 1 was for. I said, I'm separating out the Halbrand stuff into its own thing. Even if Halbrand returns to the Southlands, I will treat that as the Halbrand storyline, separate from everything. So, if you have a comment about him and scenes Galadriel was in with him or other characters, that's what part 1 is for. If you comment on Halbrand in this section, I will delete it, because that's not what it's for. I want to give focus on how they did Númenor in general. And yes, it might totally subsume the other stuff eventually, but we'll see. In terms of how they did Númenor in general, I actually really liked it. Once Halbrand left, that Elendil just seemed like it was so weird with him, and then the council scene. But as soon as Halbrand left, it's like I was watching a different show when they then had that Elendil and Miriel scene talking about the factions in Númenor. That was really good. I mean, it was pretty decent. So that's why I'm treating this separately. First off, the overall look and feel was really good. They've been on this isolated island country, it's a big island, for thousands of years, and their society has achieved utopia. In all ways, except that they are still mortal. That they're sitting around living this utopian society, but there's still death. But they showed it's like a mix of medieval with ancient Egypt, and, what we think of as Golden Age Greek togas and stuff, that it looks like this really advanced society in terms of the architecture, the costuming. They got that right, that it looks, this is a perfect society, and it's flourishing at a higher level than we see in Middle-earth, where it's even more backward than we've seen in other ages, because they didn't recover from the war. In terms of the look and feel, I like that. Again, this is the mother country for Gondor and Arnor, that Minas Tirith is a surviving colony of Númenor, and they never achieved this height again. So I like that they reverse engineering what would Minas Tirith look like as this city that stretches from horizon line to horizon line, or Menelaus, their capital city, that this is the mother country. This is so much bigger. And you see all the megastructures, the Númenorian fondness for megastructure statues. They're all over the place, and the cliffs leading there. The cityscape is in the design of Minas Tirith, but on a vaster scale. All of that visual stuff they got right. Also the music. I said in my introduction, I do really like Bear McCreary. He just hasn't had too much of a chance to shine yet on this series. Except for that I really liked his take on the dwarf theme, and he explained, well, this is before their downfall, so it's industrious and happy. And then at Comic-Con, then we saw it, and yeah, that's a really standout music piece. This is the second time I really noticed the music, because of the Númenor theme he developed, which is like a mix of some tones from the Gondor stuff with like an ancient Egyptian drum motif. I'm not sure on the specific, but that works really well, because there's this big Egyptian influence on Númenor, in the, not for real life, but in the pop culture sense of this vast human empire with megastructures and a king who's basically a god on earth because of his power, just the amount of power they wield. That it looks like that. Tolkien himself said, like, their crowns were, he described it as pharaonic. That this is like the Pharaoh is a living god making pronouncements. They're so powerful. So I like that they gave it almost an Egypt motif, the popular conception of the pharaohs in ancient Egypt, to show just how much more advanced and powerful they are. So that was a good choice. So that's what we got overall. Then when they actually they did a pretty good job of setting up the basic political situation in Númenor that, well, first off, before Elendil, there was Galadriel, and I said, there is an art to doing exposition well, and I'm worried that they're not always introducing things well for movie-only audience. I am a hardcore book fan, and I'm the one arguing, don't make that a prominent Easter egg if people won't understand it. Like last episode I said, I loved the Elrond and Celebrimbor scene talking about Fëanor's hammer making the Silmarils, but when it was done I realized they never explained what the Silmarils are. This would be lost on the general audience. So I'm always worried about that, and for that you see the hardcore sub-fraction of the fandom who are the book fans, and this is one of the most established book fandoms because it's the original fantasy book fandom. If you're criticizing, they condense the lore, so long as it's in the spirit of the lore. Like I talked about in the prologue, that you don't need to describe the full War of Wrath against Morgoth in explicit detail, any more than the prologue to Fellowship of the Ring needed to be a blow-by-blow account of the War of the Last Alliance. It's meant to be a simplified introduction, as you would explain to a hobbit, and then gradually add more detail. So I like how they did it with Galadriel at first going, and in this case Halbrand's just a sounding board, he's not really part of that. She's expositing for the viewers, well, the humans in the Southlands are descendants of the humans who sided with Morgoth, but the humans on Númenor are descendants of the humans who sided with the Elves in the war. And as a reward, they were given this island kingdom in the middle of the ocean. And they've been here for thousands of years, and they were friends with the Elves for centuries, and we traded knowledge, visited constantly. But in the past couple of centuries, they have been turning away the Elves. They haven't been here in a long time. That, as a simplified exposition, that was really good. It's for the newcomers. But the big thing for me was the Elendil scene with Miriel, explaining that, yes, this is what Númenor was like, that, like I said, they have utopia, they have everything except they don't have immortality like the Elves do, and on their island, and they've achieved everything except that, they eventually grew jealous of the Elves, and are increasingly angry about that they won't share immortality, and the Elves are, oh, you can't or won't, and they're like, both! That no, we should not give you immortality, and for that matter, we can't. That would belong to God alone. We can't do that, and we wouldn't even if we could. So, showing that at first the majority of Númenorians have turned on the Elves, but then showing with Elendil that there's this persecuted minority who are still friendly with the Elves, and then showing to Galadriel later that, yeah, some of us still study Elvish, we teach our children Elvish, we are still faithful to the Elves, and to the Valar, the gods behind them. But that Miriel scene, I also like from a philology perspective, Tolkien language, her going, your name means elf friend, technically, because, it means one who likes the stars, Tolkien would like that. But that's a thing that in the book, actually, politically, they switch languages as a political signifier. That when the Númenorian kings reach a point where they're really openly anti-elf, well, originally the Númenorians all spoke Elvish because they were the allies of the Elves in the war against Morgoth. There came a point where they started openly taking names in their own language, and they stopped speaking Elvish at court. That the language spoken in Númenor now is called Adonaic, and they're representing it as English, but it's not common speech. This is the precursor to common speech. They're not the same, but whatever. But that they reached a point where they said they stopped taking Elvish names, and instead of calling themselves Tar Palantir or Tar Miniatur, Pharazôn. Pharazôn is an Adonaic name with that chancellor who was like the nephew of the previous king. So they started taking names like Pharazôn and Adunakor, a lot of K's in that. But the minority, the persecuted religious minority, essentially, who still are faithful to the Elves, they still take Elvish names like Elendil. And the loose comparison I can think of off the top of my head is like, Imagine, like, you know how in Spanish, Guillermo is a Spanish version of William? Imagine, like, a Spanish-speaking group immigrating into an English-speaking country. It's a political choice whether you name your child Guillermo or William. There's some who go, no, I've broken ties, my name is William, or ones who defiantly go, my name is Guillermo, I'm not giving up on that allegiance. So, like that, that is a thing in the book, the choice of name. That isn't even something the TV show made up. That's a nod to the book, so that even choosing what name they have in Elvish or not is a political signifier. Also, like in that conversation, she said, oh, it's from the western side of Númenor. The western side of Númenor facing the Undying Lands is where most of the elf friend minority is located. Actually, they call themselves the Faithful, capital F. And if you notice, if you turn on the subtitles in that scene, when she refers to the Faithful aren't loyal to the crown, some say, it says Faithful with a capital F. So I'm not going to say elf friends, I'm going to say the Faithful from here on out, the faithful elf friends. Also, like in that scene that you see, and this is a thing in the book, that the white tree they have, it's a cutting descendant from the two trees that you saw in the beginning, the holy trees that were there before the sun and moon. It's a cutting of the first tree, that they gave a cutting to the elves, who took another cutting and took it to a different island, who then gave one to Númenor. It's called Nimloth. And the white tree of Gondor that you see in the movies is a seedling cutting of Nimloth. Or I think there's another point where the tree died, but they found a seedling. Anyway, it's that you see that this is where the Gondor symbol comes from, the white tree. And I like that, if you notice, they say they stopped honoring the tree, but they didn't dare harm it for a couple of generations. That the tree is still there, but the shrine to it is crumbling into ruins. The archways have fallen. That they've ignored it, but they're not willing to tear it down yet out of fear. That was a nice, just visual touch to there, that they're ignoring it. So setting up the political situation with that there's, okay, the Faithful of Numenor are basically a thinly veiled allegory for Roman Empire, the Christian minority being fed to the lions. They are the oppressed Christians in the Roman Empire. It's barely a metaphor. That's what they're going for, and if things will get bad, that eventually, in the books, Sauron convinces them that Morgoth is the one true god, who will, even though he's been cast out of the world, he is the one true god, and only he can give them immortality, which they lust after. And he'll make temples to Morgoth, and eventually this culminates in a lot of human sacrifice. And compared to House of the Dragon, which I don't think they're really, I don't think this is a fair comparison. That would be an R-rated movie, House of the Dragon. Versus, I mean, there's sex in it, there's a lot more violence. This is a PG-13 movie, essentially, that the ads for Rings of Power are targeted to children or young teenagers, like 10-year-olds. So there isn't that much sex in it. Like, Galadriel was basically just wearing a thin shift in the water. If this was Game of Thrones, they would have been focusing on her wet t-shirt thing. Instead, the camera was avoiding that. The part of me that went, Game of Thrones, the old Game of Thrones would have really played up the sexiness of this, and they actually didn't. They shouldn't have to, because this is not age appropriate. That they want this to be aimed at 10 to 13-year-olds. And when people go, the dialogue isn't as dense, it shouldn't be, because it should be the level that the movies were at, which wasn't as dense either. But in terms of violence, to do the story right, by like season 3 or 4, they will be having literal human sacrifice to Satan. Morgoth is literally Satan, and there'll be a lot of human sacrifice to the devil on this show. And I don't know if people are going to complain about that, because Tolkien was a very staunch Catholic, and it's like, well, yeah, they're the bad guys. That the bad guys in this show are literally worshipping the devil with human sacrifice, and the good people have turned on him. And the good people are the oppressed minority who are opposing that. And I really like how they played Elendil in this, both in that scene and with his children later. just in turn, and with Galadriel, that you get this sense of his inherent, the way the actor played it's good, this his inherent dignity, that again, Christian in the Roman Empire, being oppressed, hiding his allegiance, that Elendil is Lot in Sodom, or I guess a better analogy with Númenor would be he's Noah. That, and this is, I got the feeling from his performance, how he was written, it matches the book, that Elendil is God's righteous man, is surrounded by his enemies. That this is one of the few righteous men left. I will not destroy Sodom if you can find even, what was it, 7 righteous men in it. And then he goes, well, Lot's family's really the only righteous people, so screw it, let's just get Lot out of there and burn it down. But the Noah thing, that's such an iconic myth of he's the last good person, him and his family, and outside of that there's just nothing but murder of brother against brother, and violence and theft, and maybe even human sacrifice, depending on the version you go with. That God's righteous man in a society, that the last righteous man in a society that's falling down on itself out of man's own greed and hubris. I actually think they did that pretty well with Elendil. Again, his scenes with Halbrand are stupid, but that's the Halbrand storyline, not his storyline. I like other things, like when he's talking to Isildur, his son, going like, Isildur isn't really that keen on being a sailor, and he's emphasizing there is no future for us in Númenor, even in the Westlands. All of you need to learn how to build ships and sail ships, because there will come a point where we need to flee. Again, the Noah analogy, that I need you to know how to build boats and sail them so we can flee. He sees what's coming on the horizon like Noah. So all that was great. All of the Elendil scenes, the point where he goes actually to Galadriel talking in Elvish, there is a minority of us who still like the elves. I'll take you to our Hall of Laws where we have our archives. That was also a sad scene. I think they did that on purpose to emphasize, look at all of this knowledge in this really extensive library. Because in the books they mention, all we managed to get out of Númenor was what Elendil's family had on hand. That there's entire libraries worth of thousands of years of knowledge that were lost forever. The whole thing of Babylon's lost, and all the knowledge went down with it. Or it is Atlantis, all the knowledge of man that went down with it. Because this will all be destroyed. And when they do show the destruction of Númenor, I think they need... Oh, spoilers, Númenor gets destroyed. It's a prequel, you know it's not there anymore. They talk about it being destroyed in The Lord of the Rings. But I hope that when they eventually show Númenor's destruction, they will emphasize the destruction of the libraries to show it wasn't just the buildings that were destroyed, it's the culture and knowledge was lost. That just how much was destroyed from that. One scene I wasn't keen on in terms of exposition was in that library scene where they show a painting of Elrond and Elros. He goes, well, Elros built this library. They didn't explain who Elros was yet. Maybe they will in a future episode, because, like I said with the Silmarils, if you're going to introduce something, you need to explain what it is. And other than, oh, this library was built by Elrond's brother. Wait, why was he a king? Maybe they'll explain that later. There's a couple more episodes. I'll give them that one. Maybe they'll explain what the Silmarils are later. But again, it's the nature of the show that these aren't structured as episodes, but as an 8-hour movie they cut up. And I'm all for that, but I don't think it's new user-friendly. Also the thing with that, oh, the map is really in the symbol. I throw that in with the Halbrand storyline of how much they're condensing the Sauron stuff. We think he's Sauron, but that's separate from all of this. But in terms of setting up the Faithful of Numenor, oh, I forgot to mention, I like that they kept track of this with Miriel when she's explaining when they turned on the elves. Let me whip out my copy of Unfinished Tales with my bookmark here. She says, oh, we haven't welcomed elves to our shores since the time of my grandfather's great-grandfather. Her grandfather was Gimmelzor, and his great-grandfather would be, yes, Adunacor. who technically is called Herunumen in Elvish, but he didn't call himself that. Adunakor was the first king to openly turn on the elves like that. I don't know if they have the rights to the names from Unfinished Tales, but she'll just go my great-grandfather, and that's enough. But you can tell they're paying attention, that it was specifically her grandfather's great-grandfather. By the way, I remember all the kings' names from the way they're listed in the book, where they have, like, king is Tar, or R in a Danaic. So I remember Tar Palantir, R Pharazon, R Dunakor. The TV show left that off, that they just call him Pharazon, which, okay, fine, it's the literal translation of king, and they left that out, and it's easier to remember, but just in my head, I keep calling him R Pharazon. Whatever, so they kept in those little details. And also with Muriel, at first I didn't like her, but then, okay, it was a twist at the end, you got me. That Muriel is a character in the books, and I like that she is the daughter of Tar Palantir, that they had turned on the elves in the time of her grandfather's great-grandfather. Her father, the king who's locked up, Tar Palantir, he repented of the ways of his father and grandfather and said, no, we need to be friends with the elves. But by this point, the faithful were such a minority that all the anti-elf faction turned on him and locked him up. That's actually a thing in the books, that Númenóreans, the kings, would often retire as they got into old age, rather than, they said, live on senile and in dotage and unable to rule. Think like a papal resignation, that they would retire and let their sons rule when they got late in life. But as a sign of their yearning for immortality in the last 2 generations, they would rule until they were senile. But when Palantir, they called him that because it's literally the far-seeing, because he saw stuff was going to happen, and imply that he had prophetic visions even. That, yeah, it makes sense. They mentioned in the end, oh, the elf you said would come has come. He's a seer. He's a prophet. That it makes sense that when the majority party turned on him, they just used the legal excuse of, oh, he's gone senile, let's forcibly retire him, because we have a custom of kings retiring when they go senile. But at first I was like, wait, and I remembered, oh yeah, that is a thing from the books, where they can make him retire like that. What I didn't, the thing is, like, Pharazon is like a nephew, and he's kind of co-ruling, where Muriel, who is his daughter, he will eventually marry to seize the throne. And this wasn't in the book, but I like the twist at the end, that Muriel is pretending to be against the faithful because secretly she is still loyal to her father and the elves and the faithful, and it's all just an act, because otherwise she would have been booted out of power too. So it's how she infiltrated Pharazon's faction, is by pretending to turn on her father when she really didn't. Honestly got me there with the actress's performance, but at the end they went, oh no, she really is an elf friend. This is just playing around with that she's pretending. Christians hiding their identity in the Roman Empire, facing persecution and all that. So that stuff worked pretty well. I also like that they mentioned the guilds briefly, and this is, I don't know if they have the rights to Unfinished Tales. They mentioned there's a lot of trade guilds in Númenor. It's a big thing with them. And they have, like, the Shipbuilders Guild, the Guild of Venturers. So when Elendil's daughter Yarian says, oh, I got into the Builders Guild, like Architect Guild or something. Guilds are a thing in Númenor. That was a nod to that. I'll leave it to the geekier, more in-depth channels to go over that in some detail. But yeah, that was all fine. I also like how they refer to Halbrand as, not that part of the Halbrand storyline is stupid, but in general, they refer to men from Middle-earth as low men. That's a thing from the books. It shows just how much they think they are above everyone else. That everyone who living in Middle-earth, in primitive conditions, they're the low men. Which they say with some credibility, because, like, the kingdoms in Middle-earth, they're not even on the level the Rohirrim are on that you see in Lord of the Rings. They are living the way people are living in the Southlands. Generally peaceful, living in wood houses. They're not building cities. They get by, but things were pretty bad for kingdoms of men. Even in the Second Age, things were not great. So overall, their presentation of Númenor, I mean, Elendil I liked. Isildur and his daughter not as much, but they're younger. They're supposed to be young and inexperienced, so whatever. So all of this with the faithful, I really hope that they have the courage to play up. This is Christians going to be Christians fed to lions. That there is a good chance Iarian, if I were writing this, I would have Iarian by like season 4 captured by our Pharazôn and literally killed as a human sacrifice on the temple altar to Morgoth to show how far they have fallen and to keep the personal stakes in this. And that may well happen. So we'll see how they go with that. That this is a show that Numenor, with this, there's this persecuted minority who are still faithful to the real God. This is going to be Christians fed to lions. So yeah, I'm worried about that. They need to explain the Elros thing, but maybe that was them seeding that. That's all the Numenor stuff. I am not going to make a separate video about the Southlands, simply because there wasn't that much plot-wise, but it was really good. I liked the Southlands in this episode. It was shorter, it was action stuff. Arondir was good in it. And this is when you really get a good look at the prosthetics again, orcs, and showing that the sun burns them. All of that was great. It's mostly action, that Arondir feels bad. They're killing a tree that's, a 100-year-old tree. I hate it when people do, yeah, you kind of sometimes need to cut down a forest to get, firewood, but cutting down, the orcs do that. They'll cut down trees just because they hate them. They hate living, anything that's good, Treebeard says that they'll cut trees down just out of hate. That this is a tree that's been alive for centuries, how could I kill it? I remember, you remember the old Far Side comic? There was this bitter one-panel comic where these two lumberjacks are looking at it, the rings on a redwood they just cut down, and the guy's pointing to it going, and wow, here's a ring that shows where it miraculously survived yet another forest fire. And it's, you just killed the tree, and you are impressed by how the rings are showing how long it lived. That's sickness. So the tree thing is, I love that Arondir, after he cuts the tree down and cuts the branches down, he made crude spears out of the branches and kills the orc who told him to cut it down with one of its severed branches. That was nice. But there's not much to say about the Southlands thing. I'm lumping it in here because Southlands is, I was either going to put it in here or the Harfoot video, but might as well put it here because it's Elves. That Elves, Galadriel, Numenor, Halbrand is in Numenor, he's part of the Southlands. Just mentioning it briefly that it was an action thing, it was good. I've talked about the prosthetics on the orcs before in a whole separate video. Check the playlist. I have a video on the interview where they explain the design of the orcs. I'll link that below and at the end. They look whiter because they're pale. They've been living underground for centuries. And they have, even in Lord of the Rings, they don't have tolerance for the sun. They have less now. You can see it burning them, sizzling. So it's a short action thing with their trap. They're fighting really good prosthetic orc stuff. Some people didn't like their version of a warg. I did, because, they're like dogs. There's different breeds of them. That was nice. It was short action. It was good. I don't know what the Adar thing they teased at the end that he's an elf is going to be, but don't talk about that here. I'm leaving the Adar stuff for episode 4 review. I will review that in its place. If you talk about Adar, I will delete it. This was just... This episode's events in isolation were pretty good. I said I didn't like the Southlands in episode 1, maybe because it's stuff they're going to condense later. Then I really liked it in episode 2 with Bronwyn and her son fighting off that orc. It was very well filmed. And this was also, the Southlands were okay. The Numenor stuff minus Halbrand, also okay. I will point out, I think others have remarked on this, I said direction-wise, that, let me look it up here. They had a different director this episode. Bayona did the first 2, and this is Wayne Chiip. And there's only 3 directors in the first season, and there's another woman named Charlotte Brandstrom who will do episodes 6 and 7. I don't know if it's I don't like this director as much, because sometimes in the script it says do a really silly camera thing, and the director has no choice. But, the other parts of the episode had good camera direction, so I'm more inclined to think this was a script thing. And it's a different writer. There's actually different writers for every episode. Payne and McKay only personally wrote the first one. That might be it. But that scene where Galadriel is riding, and it goes into really slow-mo, was so stupid. And otherwise, I liked her in Elendil. I would have even liked, oh, it's her having fun riding. And not even that it slowed down to show her. Like, I've seen other slow-mo. This wasn't like half speed. This was like quarter speed to a tenth speed. I mean, it nearly paused, if you follow me. And they had her holding a grin in like 1/10 speed to the point it looked really weird. So I'm not opposed to even the idea of, oh, a slow-mo shot showing how much fun she's having riding. This wasn't a half-speed slow-mo. This was like pausing in bullet time or something. That was a very bad shot, but the rest of the episode I had no camera work problems with, so I'm inclined to think that was from the script. But I'm willing to forgive one or two weird shots. It's not like it ruins the whole story or even the camera work of the episode as a whole, right? So whatever. So that was the camera stuff. So Númenor, isolated from Halbrand, was good. The Southlands, an invented storyline, but a generic, this could have been happening as side stories of elves running into the Return of the Orcs off-screen in the books. This could have happened. It was generic enough. It was fine. I like that orc Vrath, he's a veteran Lord of the Rings guy. He's actually been on some fan YouTube channels doing interviews recently, Brophy, that he played the orc in the Two Towers. It was like, let's eat Merry and Pippin, they're fresh. That was him. So he's been a veteran orc actor. He's in the prosthetics again. He played Nori the dwarf in The Hobbit under prosthetics again. He's a veteran actor. He's really good at the orc stuff. I liked all of that. Part 3, I'm going to talk about the Harfoot storyline in isolation. Originally, I was going to shove the Southland stuff in there, but kind of makes more sense here because it's a bit more connected to this storyline, the Rise of Sauron, than the Harfoot stuff. That's going to be part 3. But Númenor setting up, there's this oppressed religious minority who are still faithful to the Elves. Elendil as, he's Noah, he's God's righteous man. I like the writing on him, I like the acting on him. If you hit, because a lot of people have been avoiding watching this show, as a thought experiment, I wonder what it would be like if you showed someone a supercut of every scene that didn't have Halbrand in it. That would be interesting. Like back a month ago when they were just giving us previews, if they had put out a preview clip, imagine, tell me in the comments, they put out a preview clip of just the scene where Elendil and Miriel are talking about the Faithful of Numenor. That would have been pretty impressive to me. But the other stuff, and I know half a rotten onion is a rotten onion, that you can't avoid the Halbrand stuff, and it might be redeemed if it's okay, he's not really who he says he is. He's either Sauron or the Witch King. Númenor in general was okay. Some people are probably going to ask about the race stuff with Miriel. My thing is, Númenor is a multi-continent empire at this point. Like, they have vast literal colonies that they have conquered along the coasts of Harad and Umbar, which is basically North Africa to them. Maybe her mother was from the colonies. There's lots of Númenorians living in Umbar at this point. So it's as opposed to, like, you're this isolated tribe living in the northern wastes that you wouldn't run into black people. It's like, there's Númenorians going all over different continents. I don't take issue with that. I wish they would say, oh, your mother was from Umbar or something, but as a one-liner and then move on. I say that with the other things. I'd like them to say what they've said in interviews. You need for people to take the racial diversity seriously, there needs to be an in-universe explanation for it. As simple as, oh, Disa is from one of the southern dwarf clans, because there's 4 we never saw on screen in the books. I don't have a problem with that. I thought the actress was nice. So fine, there's ways that we could headcanon it. I'd rather, and I know that people go, oh, it's excuses, but Númenor controls vast swaths of Harad at this point in time. So I'm not sure how they're playing it, that if anything, their borders of their colonies in Gondor should go right up to the Southlands. If the Southlands are Nirn in Mordor, it's actually not that, like, Pelargir should exist at this point in time. Pelargir is the main port of Gondor, at the mouth of the river downstream from Minas Tirith. I don't think Minas Tirith has been built yet, or if it is, it's a hill fort. But the main settlement is Pelargir. You saw that briefly in the Lord of the Rings movies, when the fleet is showing up, that Aragorn then brings the dead out to attack. I think it was in the extended version. That they mention it, it's more from the books. Their main port is Pelargir. That's not that far away from the Southlands, which I originally thought were far away in Harad or South Gondor. No, it's like right over the mountains. Numenor stuff was good. The Halbrand stuff I'm a little iffy on. Every now and again, the writing for Galadriel is a little too stiff. It worked in the first episode where the teleplay was by McCain and Payne themselves. And rather than giving up on... And there were good Galadriel scenes in this. Rather than giving up on her writing in the 3rd out of 8 episodes in a first season, maybe it's just that I don't like this specific writer. People need to back up and look at the behind-the-scenes stuff of, maybe we don't like the director on this. I liked the one in episode 2, Bayona. Maybe this is, I'm looking here, Jason Cahill and Justin Dobble. Maybe I don't like their take on Galadriel. And let's see, next week it's Stephanie Folsom is co-writing with Payne and McKay. So let's see we'll have to, at the end of the season, back at the season as a whole. And sometimes on a show you can tell, like on Star Trek, I remember you could distinctly tell certain writers had a different take on different characters and drastically different take on the same character, and because they were fighting in the writer's room about the direction of given characters. So McCain and Payne are back next episode. I'll judge the dialogue then on its own merits. We've seen the Adar stuff, looks like an invention. I will judge that as it comes. I want them to actually give exposition on who was Elros, what are the Silmarils. At last point, that was another thing along those lines of when Galadriel lists off her, I didn't like that whole throne room scene. I am Galadriel of the Noldor of the Golden House of Finarfin. Noldor is the Elvish word for High Elves. There's the 3 kinds of elves. There's High Elves, Grey Elves, and Wood Elves, in that order. Noldor is the Elvish word for High Elf. You need to explain what that is. You can't... Maybe they thought it'd be an impressive Easter egg. And she is of House Finarfin, and there's 3 houses of the High Elves. Fëanor is basically Slytherin, Fingolfin is basically Gryffindor, Finarfin is basically Hufflepuff, in the sense that they're very diplomatic and good at making allies. They were the only... House Finarfin were the only ones that tried to really build up alliances with the dwarves or the humans. And that is a thing, like in terms of like video game skills, we're the ones who have access to allies because we have good relations with everyone. Why are they called the Golden House? Because they're noted for their gold hair. You see, Tolkien's idea of beauty was a lot like what his wife looked like, which was black hair, very pale skin, and piercing blue eyes. Like what Gil-galad looks like in this series. That's what most High Elves look like. They're actually black-haired. People go, oh, this is some Aryan race thing. He thought black-haired and blue-eyed was really pretty. And the exception to this is... because her mother was actually from a different group of elves. She has blonde hair. Well, no, she has really pretty, sparkling silver gold hair. That's a whole thing I'm not going to get into, but it's the Golden House because it's unusual for High Elves to be blonde. Most of them aren't. And I'll talk about that more later. That's a whole thing. So I hope they explain the different High Elf houses eventually, or who Elros was, or who the Silmarils were. That this isn't bad to me, but... as a book reader, I would have introduced this information more gradually, rather than just dumping it on the audience, leaving the new people in mystery, and then slowly, retroactively explaining, well, this is what the Silmarils are. You need to go in order. And like the info on Númenor generally was like that, from the broad to the specific of, this was founded by the humans who sided with the elves. But lately they've turned on us. In like the past 5 generations. But wait, there's a minority who are still faithful. They gradually peeled back the layers and got into specifics, and it was pretty good. So, I mean, good, bad, I can't really get a feel for it yet. This is flawed, or at least I'd say rough around the edges. But it is a first season of very hard to adapt source material, so we'll see how we do. Last, I'm going to move on to talking about the Harfoot storyline, which I actually felt that, relative to itself, was the best we've seen so far.